kick us off today. Proud to host today's webinar. At First Five, our vision is that one day the success of Lake County in California will be measured by the well-being of its youngest children. And our mission is to build the early childhood systems and supports needed to ensure that our youngest children are safe, healthy, and ready to succeed in school and life. Our webinar today takes us from prediction to awareness to response. We're grateful for the partnership between Lake County Child Welfare Services and Chabot-Las Positas Community College for providing the funding to make today's webinar possible. We ask that you please keep yourself on mute unless we've opened the floor up for questions. You can also leave questions or comments in the chat. We'll be monitoring that as we go along. This webinar is being recorded and will be made available on our YouTube channel for 30 days. Our teacher and guide today is Susan Bolio. We welcome her back. If you missed it last week, she was here talking about ACE's historical trauma and resilience, and you can find that on our YouTube channel. So Susan, I'm going to pass it over to you. And welcome and thank you.
Sounds good. Thank you so much, Samantha, for having me back. So I'm going to go ahead and share my screen and just confirm you can see it's all good. Can you see my screen?
Wrong screen.
It's good. Okay.
You got the notes slides for us.
Huh. Let me try.
There we go.
So so this is weird. Okay, so you're seeing the right thing now? That's so weird because I'm seeing the wrong thing on the main screen. It's fine. We can make it work. Anyone who knows me knows, like I know just enough to be dangerous with technology. So anytime things are different, I notice my amygdala sort of get activated, but it's all working as long as you can see it. That's good. Yeah, so thank you so much for having me back again. I'm really excited to sort of dig more into understanding the brain and how it works and how it wires and all of those pieces. We're going to be talking a lot too about practices and strategies, and we'll be doing some, including the one we're going to start with, that can help us to train ourselves, train our minds to be more present, to be more aware, and to help offset some of that predicting that our brain does. And we'll talk more about that in a little bit. But we're going to start with a meditation that I learned from Thomas Hubel, and it's called the 3 sync process. And so I just invite you to get yourself into a comfortable position. And as you're sort of starting to bring your attention inward, and if it helps, you can close your eyes to do that. But let's just take a sort of a snapshot or a selfie, just in this moment, recognizing physically, mentally, emotionally, where are you at in this moment? And then after you've sort of taken that snapshot, I invite you to begin to notice in your body the places and spaces that feel alive, where you feel a sense of connection to the body. And this aliveness might show up as sort of a flowing sensation or tingling or vibration or warmth. There's lots of different ways that this can show up, but just starting to tune into the parts of your body where you're noticing this flowing, this connection with the body. And I think it's really important to note as we do this that there's no right or wrong way to feel. It's not like if you're not feeling all of your body, you're doing it wrong. You know, you might only really feel an aliveness in a pinky or in, a part of your arm or leg, and that's okay. We're just simply noticing right now that sense of connection to the body and where we feel that aliveness, flowing, vibration, connection. And now shifting our attention for a few moments to the places and spaces in the body where you feel stress or tension. And so this might show up as tight muscles, as a sense of constriction. It might show up as pain or discomfort in the body. And so just scanning through the body and noticing where the body is carrying stress or tension. And then just allowing it to be, not trying to change anything in it, just becoming aware of what's present in the body in this moment. And now for a few moments, we're going to notice, start to pay attention to or become aware of maybe the places in the body where there's a sense of absence or numbing, where we don't feel a sense of connection to the body. And again, just trying to observe these places in the body without judgment. Just noticing that there's a sense of disconnection and nothing to fix in this moment. Just becoming aware. Where in the body do you not feel much connection, or do you feel a numbing or an absence? And now taking a slightly deeper inhale and a slightly longer exhale. We're going to bring our focus to our emotions and noticing what emotions are arising in this moment. Maybe there's just one emotion that's sitting with you, or maybe like popcorn, emotions are popping in and out. So just bring in your awareness and attention to your emotions and what's residing in you in this moment. And maybe even noticing if there's a connection between an emotion that you feel and a sensation in the body. And there might not be, and that's okay. But just seeing if maybe there is a sensation or two connected to these emotions that are coming out. And then taking another slightly deeper inhale, slightly longer exhale. As you bring your focus and attention to your thoughts, beginning to become aware of thought and noticing how thoughts are arising. So what thoughts are arising and how are they arising? Are they coming in slowly? Are they sort of staying and lingering? Or are thoughts popping in again like popcorn, where they come in and then they're out, and then the next thought is in and then it's out? So we're just noticing the mind and how the mind is thinking and what the mind is thinking in this moment. Just observing it, noticing. And then now turning your attention, seeing if you can sense into what part of you is aware. So what part of you is aware of the sensations in the body? What part of you is aware of the emotions that are arising? And what part of you is aware of the thoughts as they come in and out? And so not thinking about this part, but seeing if you can sense into What part of you is aware? And then closing with a grounding breath, a nice big inhale in through the nose, a slow exhale out through the mouth. And if you had your eyes closed, you can go ahead and open your eyes, bringing yourself back fully into the space. So I'm really excited. Maybe in my next life, I'll be a neuroscientist. I find the brain incredibly interesting. And so I'm looking forward to sharing some of this with you today. But we're going to do a super, super quick review of trauma and the stress response. We're going to talk a bit about neurodevelopment, trauma, and the brain. We're going to look at emotions and thought, talk a bit about neuroplasticity and mindfulness, and then sort of throughout, we'll be doing some practices that can help with regulation and resilience, and then I'll share some additional practices. Oh, there's an eagle going right by my window. That's pretty cool. I don't see that very often, so we're in town. So anyway, it's a good sign. So I just wanted to share, this journey has been really, really important for me. I'm a mother of 4. This picture is a little bit old because my little guy, he's 4 now, but it's hard to get a picture of all of them together. But when I first learned about ACEs and trauma and historical trauma and epigenetics and all of these pieces that we talked about last time, it really encouraged me to learn all I could, because I could see those patterns in my family and I could see how I was passing some of those patterns on. And I really wanted to break those patterns to create new patterns and pathways and create environments for thriving for my children. And I knew as I learned more that it wasn't just about what I did for my kids, but it really was about understanding my own healing journey and process. And so again, this is just sort of the review piece of it, but really understanding that trauma isn't the event itself, but it's what happens inside of us when the trauma occurs. Pain is not the same thing as trauma. And trauma really is about separation. It's a separation from ourselves. It's a separation from others. It's a separation even of our own energy inside of our bodies. And again, as Hubel talks about it as this trauma energy, these parts of ourselves that we have to shut down, that we have to freeze. And he talks about parking it in a numb place, which was really interesting to me as we started doing the 3 sync process, noticing these places in my body where I didn't feel any sense of connection, where there was a numbness and absencing. And so beginning to get curious about, what might be stored in those parts of the body that I'm not aware of, that have been stored for maybe decades. And they both talk about trauma as being ancient. And I think this is really important because sometimes, especially for people who grow up in really traumatic environments, it can feel like these things are happening only to us. But this trauma energy is thousands of years old. And there is a wisdom in the trauma response that if we stayed in that hyper-aroused state all the time, we wouldn't be able to survive. We wouldn't be able to continue living. We wouldn't be able to do a lot of the things that we are able to do. And so there is a wisdom in it. And yet when there's too much trauma, when we don't have opportunities to allow that energy to move through, that's when we can run into issues. And that this unresolved trauma energy does impact all aspects of who we are. And we're going to talk more about the interconnection of the mind, the body, the emotions today, and that this trauma can get transmitted. We talked about that some, we'll reference it again in the next slide, and that healing really begins with awareness. So this was such an important piece for me, is like, as long as I'm staying on automatic pilot, and we're going to talk more about that later, I don't have the awareness to change or to choose how I want to respond to what's happening. I just go into automatic pilot and I go into reactionary mode. So healing has to start with awareness. And this transmission of trauma, we talked last time about there being this historical and ancestral trauma, how that gets passed on, can get passed on through things like epigenetics. And then of course, we also just have individual traumas that happen to us, the things that happen throughout our lives, maybe as we're kids or when we get older. Some of it is stuff that happens within our families. Some are things that happen across our communities or our societies. Some are just things like natural disasters and things like COVID and, pandemics and stuff like that. And then there's also collective trauma. So how as a collective, we sort of hold this energy of trauma and how it continues to show up in all sorts of ways that continue to perpetuate more trauma on the individual and the collective. And so last time we talked about the autonomic nervous system, and an important piece of understanding the connection between adverse childhood experiences and poor physical mental health outcomes has to do with how this unresolved trauma impacts the nervous system. So recognizing that there's two pieces to the autonomic nervous system. There's the sympathetic nervous system, which is critical for the fight or flight, and then the parasympathetic, which is critical for the rest and digest. We need both to survive, but there has to be a balance in that. As long as we're in that fight or flight response too much, our body doesn't have the ability to heal and digest and rest well. And we need those things to be able to thrive and be healthy and well. And so again, this is the graph from Stephen Porges, who looking at when we're in the ventral vagal, that green area, openness, connection, curiosity. It feels good to be here. When we start to get activated into the fight or flight response, that's when we shift into that sympathetic nervous system and some of the emotions that go with that. And then if we can't run or fight from whatever the threat is, the next best option is to freeze, dissociate, check out. Our body releases all these endogenous opioids, which help us to numb out and not feel what's happening. And so recognizing where we are in that graph is really important. And I love Stephen Porges says this, that safety isn't just a lack of threat, it's the presence of connection. So it's last time we talked about how the difference between like stress and tolerable stress and toxic stress. And the main difference had to do with whether or not there were buffering supports and connections for individuals who were experiencing the trauma. So, safety really is about connection. So I'm going to talk more about Dr. Bruce Perry in a little bit, but this has been really helpful for me remembering and thinking about how the brain develops sequentially from the bottom up. And so in utero, our spinal cord is developing, our brainstem is developing, and the brainstem is really responsible for a lot of those autonomic things, respirations, heart rate, blood pressure, lots of those pieces that thank goodness we don't have to think about. So those are things when we come into this world, our brain has the ability to do that, to have our heartbeat, be able to breathe, all of those things. And then the last part of our brain to develop is the prefrontal cortex, which if you remember the handy model of the brain from Dr. Siegel, that's the part right behind the forehead, the rational thinking, logical part of the brain, doesn't fully develop until like your mid 20s, closer to 30 sometimes for men. And so it develops sequentially in this way. And I think this is really important too, because I think sometimes we might have unrealistic expectations for our kiddos who are younger, and not remembering that the thinking part of the brain takes decades to develop. And they don't come into this world knowing how to regulate, that co-regulation is something that they really need to be able to regulate their own nervous system and their own bodies. And so looking at the different parts of the brain, as Dr. Perry's neurosequential model shows, you have the brainstem, the midbrain, which he calls the diencephalon area, the limbic region, the amygdala hippocampus, and then the cortical region at the top. And then when we're thinking about it, again, we'll talk more about this towards the end, but thinking about what those different areas need to feel a sense of safety. One of the brainstem needs that sense of safety, and with that comes pattern and rhythm, and we'll talk about that. The midbrain region needs movement, and we'll talk a little bit more about that. The limbic region needs emotional engagement and connection to other caring individuals. And then the cortical region needs opportunities to learn new things. And so when the thing that Perry says is that we cannot get to the next part of the brain until the area below it is regulated. So we have to have a regulated brainstem to move into the midbrain. We have to have a regulated brainstem and midbrain to move into the limbic region, and so on. And so I talked about this last time too, how our brain wires through experience. And so on the left-hand side, that's at birth, not a whole lot of neural connections there. We talked about that. There's not a lot of experiences that, that newborns have had, but there's this explosion of connections from 0 to 7, 0 to 5, where literally, and this is really fascinating, like everything we take for granted, the colors we see, the shapes we see, how the light falls on things, shadows, how we perceive distance, all of these things are things that our brain has to learn. Our brain does not come in knowing how to do this. And so this really helped me understand why babies sleep so much. Their brains are sort of taking in all this information, and it can be really overwhelming. And so they have to sleep for their brain to be able to process it and to integrate it. And then they wake up again and they take in more information, and they have to sleep to process it and integrate it. And so it is this constant process of revising. This is what my world is. This is what my world is. Really trying to understand the world that we live in, and not just the physical world, but our interactions, how we interact with one another, how do we relate to one another, what are appropriate responses. All of these are things, another way to think about some of these things is social conditioning. What is acceptable, what's not, how we do things, how we don't. These are all things that our children and our brains need to learn how to do. And then we talked about how, that during this process of arborization or branching out, these neural connections being made, there are certain things that we do over and over and over again. And those connections become really robust. They get myelinated, so the connection happens automatic. We don't have to think about it. And this can be a really good thing when you think about a lot of the things that we do every day that would take a lot longer if we had to really pay attention to what we were doing. Everything from walking. If you've, I think a lot of us have seen or gotten to help a new little one learn how to walk. It's quite a process. It takes a lot of energy and effort for them, but through time, doing it over and over again, it gets wired and it becomes easy, automatic. As adults, we don't really have to think about it anymore unless we're walking in Minnesota on ice or things like that. And then you have this process of pruning right before puberty. So even though there's a lot more neural connections in the sort of early childhood, the brain isn't very efficient. It doesn't always take the quickest route because there's a lot of routes that it can go. And so the brain starts to prune away those things that you didn't use very often because the brain figures, well, you don't need it. And so the saying here is use it or lose it. And those of us who maybe took a second language in high school or whatever, if we haven't used it, there's probably not a whole lot that we remember from it. So it's really important to understand how the brain wires and why there are certain things that get wired in that that become automatic. And so we're going to shift a little bit and talk about sort of how we thought the brain worked, and then how neuroscientists are finding the brain sort of actually works. And so one way that we thought the brain worked was through this stimulus response, that like we're taking in the stimulus from our eyes, ears, nose, mouth, etc. And then we are having some sort of a response to it. So it's just a direct experience response. So that's one of the ways that they thought that our brain processes information. And another is called like the attentional searchlight in metaphor. And so this is like where we're focusing our attention in one area and everything else sort of like goes to the wayside. So our focus and attention can only be directed at one thing at a time. And we know to a degree that that's true. A lot of us used to pride ourselves on being able to, I just lost the word, multitask. And now we know like, yeah, multitasking isn't really a thing because we have to constantly shift our energy and focus. But our brain doesn't quite work like the attentional searchlight metaphor either, because even though we're focused on something, our brain and the rest of our nervous system and body is still paying attention to other things in the background. Okay. So one of the things I find really interesting is that so as humans, we have certain set of senses that we all sort of have, or for the most part have. And there almost becomes this belief or understanding that everyone must experience the world in the same way. But what we've come to understand is that depending on what animal, what plant you are, you might be experiencing the world very, very differently. And so this is just a really simple example of sort of the light that humans can see versus the light that bees can see. And so when bees look at flowers, they're able to see ultraviolet light, which means they see flowers very differently than we see them. So this picture on the bottom sort of shows what a bee would see when it's looking at some of these flowers. This is not how I see flowers in everyday life, but it's pretty cool. But it's not just other animals or other species that see and experience the world differently. It's also us as humans. And so it would invite you, as you're looking at this dress, to just note whether do your eyes see it as blue and black or white and gold. So just take a moment, look at the dress, and how do your eyes see this dress? And then if you would be willing to, and I can't find the way this is set up. I can't find the chat at all, Samantha. So if you could maybe just let me know, if people could just plug into the chat, do you see it as blue and black or white and gold? And let's sort of see where we collectively land.
2 white and gold.
2 white and gold.
Gold, blue and black. Say that I see it as white and gold.
Yeah.
White and gold, white and gold.
So it's really, really interesting. And when I first came across this, I showed it to my husband and my daughter, who was then 11. She's now 12. So this dress is actually blue and black. And for those of you that don't believe it, I'm with you, because my eyes see gold and white. And when I asked my husband what he saw black and blue. And when I asked my daughter, she saw blue and purple. So it's just a reminder that we can all be looking at the same thing and see it very differently, right? And so this holds true not just for the things that we see, but the things that we hear and the things that we touch. Like, so the way that we perceive the world influences how we interact with the world. And so you add to this already we have these limited sensory perceptions as humans. We don't have eyes like, we can't see ultraviolet light like bees, or we can't sense temperature like snakes, or we can't pick up magnetic, sort of the magnetism of the earth, which is what birds use to be able to, fly to the places that they go to when they migrate. So you add to our already limited perceptions, and then our brain does another really important thing. So this sort of goes back to, remember when I talked about how when we're infants, we often, we get overwhelmed. I'm sorry, I don't know if you can hear the siren. It's the first Wednesday of the month. But so when we're infants, we can get overwhelmed really quickly by all of the sensory input coming in because it's new. And so when it's new and there's all of this stuff coming in, the brain is trying to process it and make sense of it. And so one of the strategies that our brain uses is it almost has like these volume controls where it learns that certain things are not dangerous, are not a threat. And so it turns that down so that our attention can go more on what it is that we want it to. So for example, in this picture here, this kid is trying to read a book. In the background, there's the TV playing and his sister's playing with the dog. And so there's all of this stuff happening. So his brain in the background is turning down, maybe some of the auditory pieces or some visual distraction stuff so that he can focus on his book. So this is a really important strategy that our brain has. And what this means also is that we are not just directly perceiving and responding to what's happening. Depending on what things our brain is turning down, we might not even be aware of certain things that our brain is sort of hitting the mute button on. Here we go again. Okay, so So this is another sort of fun little thing. I would invite you to, it's a little bit hard to see, but underneath, I guess it would be her left eye, there are three colored dots, pink, yellow, and green. So I'd invite you just to stare at those dots. Don't look at the rest of the picture, just staring at those dots. Stare for maybe 8 more seconds. And now what I want you to do is just gently slide your eyes over to the white part of the screen and tell me what you see. Plug it in the chat, or you can unmute yourself. But what do you see as you, after you looked at the dots and you sort of look on the area that's white?
You sent a photo of her, an X.
Yeah. So do most people see her in color? You see her face, you see it in color, you see her skin, her hair. You see all that?
Yes, in color. Photo of the lady, yes, in color.
Yeah, yeah. So here's another fun one. So go ahead and try to read this. So are folks able to read this?
Someone confident is easy. Yes, easy to read. Yes, yes, yes.
Yeah, yeah. So our brain not only turns down or mutes certain things, it also fills in the blanks, right? So like we didn't actually see a photo of, we saw the negative of the photo of this person. And when we looked at the colors and looked to the white, our brain filled in the rest. Same thing with, reading these letters and symbols that are all mixed up. And at the bottom, it says, you're unlikely to be conscious of which symbols are replacing which letters. And that's true. I've read this quite a few times and I couldn't even tell you what is replacing what, but our brain is predicting based on past things. And so we're sort of going to talk about that piece now. So Dr. Lisa Feldman Barrett is a neuroscientist, and she studies the brain. And she sort of coined the term, or talks about how the brain is like a prediction machine. And I love this. She says that that neuroscientists like to say that our life is a carefully controlled hallucination. That it's constrained by our world and by our body, but ultimately our reality is constructed in our mind. She says, rather than reacting to what's actually happening in the world, our brain is making guesses and drawing on our deep backlog of experiences and memory, constructing what it believes to be your reality, cross-referencing it with incoming sense data from your heart, lungs, metabolism, immune system, as well as the surrounding world, and adjusting as needed. So it's really, really important, I think. What this helps me understand is that the experiences that we have when we're children really sort of sets the tone for what we expect to happen in the future. And I've been noticing this more on my own journey as I've been trying to heal and undo patterns and things like that, is that those pieces that are unresolved yet, I'm like, so here's an example. When I think about some things in the future, I feel really anxious about it because I don't know what's going to happen. And a lot of times growing up as a kid, if I didn't know what was going to happen, often that wasn't a good thing. It was very scary. It could be very dangerous. I could be harmed. And so my current self is projecting into the future based on my past experiences. And she talks about how the brain's main job, we think it has to do with like thinking and learning, whatever, but she says the brain's main job is actually to maintain what she calls a body budget. So the brain is constantly taking in this information from inside of our body, caloric intake and water, all of these things, and it's anticipating what's going to be needed so that we can continue to have a pretty healthy body budget. So we get thirsty before we're actually dehydrated, so that we're more likely to get water get water sooner rather than waiting until we're actually dehydrated. Same thing with sleep. So there's lots of ways that our brain is sending signals to the body based on what the body's sending it to be able to manage and regulate this body budget. She also talks about how our brain doesn't know the difference between real and imagined. And there's not much of a distinction between inside versus outside of the body. Our brain is only receiving sense data. It's not like, oh, this is data from inside the body, or this is data from outside the body. The brain processes it the same way. And so instead of our brain asking like, what is this? The brain is asking, what is this most like? What is the current thing I'm experiencing right now? What is it most like based on my previous or past experience? And so there are implications for this in our lives. She talks about how, we can't go back and change our past, but by changing the present and changing what we do in this moment, it creates sort of a new blueprint for the brain to create or predict from in the future. So when we think about like children or individuals who have experienced high trauma, we can't go back and undo that, but through practicing new things in this moment, it can provide a new blueprint for the brain to be able to predict future experiences. And she talks about like when we do this, when we invest in today, or we invest in whatever it is today, we're really investing in tomorrow. And that we need to be really careful about the sources of information that we use. And so thinking about how do we consume things like news, social media, books, movies, et cetera, because all of those things get taken into the brain, and our brain uses that to predict future stuff as well. Remember, it doesn't always know the difference between what's happening inside of us versus what's happening outside of us. And so starting to pay attention to and be more intentional about the sources of information that we let in and how much is important. And that these experiences that we have can and do create biases, ways that we anticipate things will happen into the future, and that when these biases go unchecked, it can really impact our reality, and it can impact other people. I won't go into all the bias stuff now, but there, when you think about things like implicit bias and, sort of racism and discrimination and things like that, like a lot of this plays into some of the unconscious patterns and beliefs that our individual and collective brains have around these topics that then shape how we experience and how we respond to or more likely react to what's happening. So sort of another interesting piece of this is some studies that they did on faces. And so if you are one of those people who are looking at some of these faces and you're really noticing sort of visceral reactions to it, I invite you to just notice that, maybe do some deep breathing if you're noticing some strong visceral reactions. But they did these studies on faces. And so on the left side, that would be considered a neutral face. And then it goes, on the top, it's like happy, happier, happiest, and then like upset or angry all the way to like really angry. And then at the bottom, like concerned all the way to really worried. And so what they found is that children who experience a lot of trauma, they tend to see anger much sooner than the children who did not experience a lot of trauma. And this, of course, is a survival mechanism. So if I'm a child growing up in an environment where the people who are taking care of me are really quick to like flip their lid, and if their responses either are physical or verbal abuse, I'm very likely to pick up on that sooner as a way to be able to try to protect myself or get out of Dodge or whatever it is. And one of the interesting things about the study around anger is when they looked at sort of the control group, which were the kids who hadn't experienced a lot of trauma, they saw anger much closer to anger versus the kids who experienced lots of trauma. They saw it on the happy side of neutral. So they were looking at faces from happy all the way to angry. Neutral is in the middle. Kids who experienced trauma saw anger before the face even hit neutral. So again, like we're perceiving and picking up on things sometimes quicker than others, or sometimes our perception is that it's dangerous when actually it's not. Another thing is fear, and maltreated children displayed faster reaction times than controls when labeling emotional facial expressions. And this was especially pronounced for when they saw fearful faces. And again, this has to do with if they're seeing or experiencing a lot of trauma in the household, they're going to be really conditioned to notice those fearful responses as a sort of mechanism to be able to try to protect themselves or get out of Dodge or whatever before it gets really bad. And then also neutral faces. So individuals with a high prevalence of child maltreatment, they tend to see neutral faces as negative. So I think this, again, is really important to understand that because our brains wire through experience, and no two people have had the same experiences, and our brain, the way our brains wire, are also impacted by our genetics and our epigenetics. There are no two brains that are wired the same, and therefore there are no two people that will see and perceive the world in the exact same way. So I think this is really important because a lot of times, a lot of the struggles that we have with other people have to do with seeing things differently. But the reality is that, again, nobody sees the world the same. So some of the things that Dr. Barrett talks about related to the brain and stress. So she talks about stress in the system being a withdrawal from the body budget. It takes a lot of energy when we're in that fight or flight response. That it takes a lot of energy. And so that then is like depleting the body budget. Healthy stress, on the other hand, that's a withdrawal initially, but then a deposit down the road. So we talked about things like, presenting, like me presenting, how even though I get nervous every time beforehand, it's a healthy stress because it's within a certain window, and I do the presentation, everything's okay. So my body has learned that even though I feel that stress initially, it's actually benefiting me and my system, versus chronic stress, which is that constant spending without without those deposits being made. And so we end up running a deficit. And I think pretty much all of us can think of a time in our lives where we were in that chronic stress state, and we either weren't able to or just couldn't recharge and make those deposits that we needed. And, maybe we got really, really sick, or maybe we had some sort of a mental health crisis or something that forced us to slow down, to recharge, because we can't just keep running at a deficit. And then the other thing that Dr. Barrett says is that persistent uncertainty is very, very, very hard on the human nervous system. The brain is really designed to, again, make sense of the world, to categorize things, to be able to predict into the future based on past experiences. So when our past experiences don't help us understand the current reality, it becomes very stressful. And that's why I think a lot of us, when I think about when the pandemic first hit, there were, a lot of us were in that constant chronic stress state, because from day to day, minute to minute, sometimes things were changing, and we didn't have much to call from or to, pull from as it relates to past experiences. So that can be really, really hard on the nervous system and really depleting. So, okay, yeah. So one of the things that is really exciting, though, is that we do have the ability to change and to shift the way that our brains wire. And I remember back in the day when I was learning about the brain, it was like, you're born with all the brain cells you'll ever have, right? And sort of like, we have sayings like, you can't teach an old dog new tricks, to sort of insinuate that once you get to a certain age, you've sort of learned all that there is to learn. But the reality is that the brain is constantly learning and rewiring. And there's a neuroscientist, his name is Dr. David Eagleman. He's got some really interesting research and science that he's doing. But he coined the term live wired, because we've been talking about neuroplasticity for a couple decades now. But he says even that term is lacking, because plasticity, plastics, they're malleable when that plastic is hot, but as soon as it goes into a mold and then that mold hardens, or that plastic hardens, it's no more it's not malleable anymore. You can't change it or adapt it. And so our brain isn't like that. It's not like in the first 5, 10, 15 years after that, the brain will forever be that way. We constantly have the ability to rewire in new pathways, to learn new things. And Dr. David Eagleman did an interview with Brene Brown. And when he was talking, like towards the end of their conversation, he said to her, like, literally right now, your brain structurally looks different than it did before we started this conversation. So the things that you are learning have rewired your brain, and those changes actually can be seen. So it's pretty cool to think about that. And that gives me a lot of hope for myself and for others who have experienced lots of trauma, that we do with intention, with practices like some of the ones we practiced last time, and the 3-sync and others that we'll practice, we have the ability to wire in new practices, to wire in for greater awareness, so that we can have more agency in how we choose to respond to the world that we're perceiving. And so just a quick reminder again that, new experiences mean new connections. And so, you have here on the left, you have new synapses, new skills and experiences that create then new neural connections. And the more that you practice these things, it strengthens those synapses and neural connections, and then other ones get weakened. So, sometimes when we're trying to do something new, trying to eat healthier, trying to move our bodies more, trying to practice mindfulness and awareness, it can feel really challenging at first, because we literally are going against our current neural wiring. And so it can feel uncomfortable. It can be really frustrating, but just remember, and I sort of use this analogy, like, do you remember when we all used to have like flip phones, instead of like smartphones, right? And so we all had these flip phones, and then these smartphones came out, and it was like cool, but also super frustrating, because I didn't know how to run most of it, right? So there's this learning curve that happens. And I know I was one who was like, I want to go back to the flip phone, but I'm glad I didn't, that I stuck with it. And I was able to learn some of the stuff, although there's still probably like 5 million things my phone can do that I don't know that it can do, because I'm not that good at it yet. But so it's just this reminder that there often is this period where things are really uncomfortable and they're very challenging, and we have to really think about it, and we have to be super intentional. But the more that we practice it, the better we get, the more automatic it becomes. So I want to sort of pause there, and let's just maybe take a moment or two to check in. So we're going to check in with our body, our mind, our emotions. So noticing, like, what sensations do you feel right now in the body? So just taking a couple moments to notice that. Noticing maybe what thoughts are present or what questions you have. And then also noticing what emotions are present for you right now. Oh, I can see the chat down here. I don't, but I can't access it. That's so weird. Okay, let me see if I can pull this. No, weird. Okay, so Samantha, I'm sorry, I'll have to have you sort of watch the chat too, but any questions that are coming up for you right now, or even just thinking about this question, like, how does understanding how the brain processes information help you better understand your own experiences, or maybe even the experiences of others? So you can either unmute yourself, or you can plug it into the chat. That would be great. And if there aren't any thoughts or questions yet, that's okay. I know it's it's kind of a lot. And you can also, if questions come up throughout, we'll have some time at the end too. So you can absolutely plop them in the chat and we can go through them at the end of the presentation as well. All right. So if there aren't any questions or thoughts about this, let's shift into emotions. So I think I might have talked about it, just touched on emotions a little bit last week, but some pieces that have really helped me understand what emotions are connected to these three photos. So a lot of times sensations or emotions show up as sensations in the body. And so that's why, I sort of invite you to notice the sensations that are happening in a 3-sync process. I invited you to, as you were noticing emotions, maybe notice if there was a place in the body that you felt it. And so this picture of the individuals comes from a study where they were looking at like how and where people tend to feel different emotions. And so the areas that are red or that are yellow are really warm or hot. The areas that are dark or blue are cold. And so noticing even, and it might be a little bit hard to see, but the difference between depression, which has lots of like dark through the torso and the head, and then some blue in the arms and the legs, compared to something like happiness, where there's a lot of yellow in the face and in the chest area and red throughout the body, warmth and blood and movement. And so just noticing, the depression would be like if you're in that blue area, if you're thinking about the Stephen Porges, that's that blue area on top, compared to that happiness would be you're down in your ventral vagal, that green area down below. So we tend to notice emotions show up differently in the body. Emotions are also like everything across this universe are energy, and they can actually be measured. It's really interesting. There's an organization called the HeartMath Institute, and they've done some really interesting research looking at how the heart is literally constantly sending out electromagnetic signals as well as receiving them from others around us. And so these are, again, things that they're able to measure, this energy of emotions. And then emotions are also chemicals in the body. So the sort of, I call it like the chemical cocktail of happiness is very different than the chemical cocktail of depression. And so, for example, if we're feeling a lot of happiness and joy, we might be having a lot of oxytocin and dopamine running through our system. Whereas if we're feeling a lot of sadness or depression, we might be having a lot of cortisol, or we might be having sort of those what are they called? The natural endogenous opioids for, numbing the body out. So we might feel a lot of numbness and disconnection versus, when we feel connection through things like oxytocin and dopamine. So emotions aren't just, things that we make up in our mind, although we make up the names for these things, but these are actual things that happen in the body, ways that our body is able to notice. Are we feeling stressed, or are we feeling connection and joy right now? And the HeartMath Institute said in their research, they found that when people had a really big emotional shift from, say, depression to joy, over 1,400 neurochemicals shifted instantly in the body. And those changes lasted for up to 2 hours. So the HeartMath Institute talks about emotions as being regenerative or non-regenerative, which I really like, because emotions aren't good or bad, which I'll talk about in a minute, but they can be regenerative or non-regenerative because they're connected to biochemicals in our body. So things like stress hormones, or things like oxytocin and dopamine, right, which are more regenerative compared to cortisol and adrenaline, which is non-regenerative in the body and can actually speed up. I think we talked about this last time, speed up our biological clock, shorten our telomeres, right? So it has these physical impacts on the body. This is a great TED Talk by a woman named Dr. Susan David, who researches emotions. And she talks about emotions as just being part of the human experience. And she calls them the spice of life. And I love this because, sometimes, especially on a difficult day, I might be like, well, yeah, I don't want to feel sadness or grief or loss or disappointment or whatever. Like, those are not fun feelings to feel. But if I don't want to feel those emotions and I shut myself down to that, then that means I'm also shutting myself down to love and joy and connection and excitement and all of those emotions that are fun to feel, that are good, that feel good to feel. So we don't have the ability to sort of turn on and turn off only certain emotions. We either can be open or we can be closed. And of course, there are degrees of that. We're not all open or all closed, but depending on whether we're open or closed to feeling certain emotions, it's we can't just shut off the ones that are difficult. And these emotions are really, really valuable. They give us data. They help us understand how we are experiencing the world, how things are resonating with us. And they can be teachers. They can show us where our values are. If we feel really angry or upset because we see somebody do something that isn't right to somebody else, that's because it's coming up against a value. It's not a bad thing to feel anger. I say this often to my kids, all emotions are okay, but not all responses to our emotions are okay. If we're feeling angry and upset, it is okay to feel that, but it is not okay to harm another person with our body or with our words. And so being able to find healthy outlets to allow these big emotions, these difficult emotions to move through without shoving them down, without trying to quiet them. I attended, and this was pre-COVID, and I can't remember the name of the guy presenting, but he was talking about emotions. And he said a lot of times with the difficult emotions, it's like, we feel it coming up and then we quick shove it down and slam the door to the basement. We're like, whew, avoided that one. I didn't blow up on that person, right? Or whatever it was. But in the meantime, those emotions go down into the basement, he said, and it's like they lift weights, they work out, they get stronger, and then they come back and they hit us when we're least expecting it. So just because we aren't maybe always feeling that emotion doesn't mean that it's not still there. And anytime we're trying to repress something, I think of it like this: if you've ever tried to push a beach ball down in the water, sort of the harder you push it down, as soon as if you lose your grip or you let go, the harder it's going to pop back up, right? So like what we give our energy to, we're giving our energy to those difficult emotions, and they're getting stronger and stronger. And so the invitation is to, when these difficult emotions come up, to allow ourselves to move through them, to have practices that we do, going for a walk, calling a friend, journaling, writing, art, breath practice. There's so many different things that we can do to help that energy be able to move through instead of getting stuck in our bodies. And so we're going to talk a little bit about triggers. Thomas Hubel talks about how, so when we're experiencing something, you experience this thing in the moment. And if your response equals whatever that experience is, that's a good indicator that you're moving from a place of response versus reaction. So let's say something happens and I overreact, or something happens and I underreact, that I check out, I disconnect. That's a good indicator that there's a trauma response in there, that there is something unresolved within me that is coming up. A lot of times we tend to think like, oh, I feel upset, or I'm angry because this person said that, or this person did that. But what I'm learning is that the more that I recognize what's coming up in me and what's unresolved, it's less about what they say or do. I'm trying to think of an example. So here's an example. My oldest daughter, one of the things that she used to do was, and she still does sometimes, is she has a very short temper, and she comes by it honestly. And that's, I know she's working on that. And when she gets really short fused like that, she gets really snarky and crabby and says some pretty mean things sometimes. And so when she was younger and I was experiencing this, I would notice a huge response in me. I would get really angry. I would feel really upset. I would either start yelling, or I would completely check out. I would just disengage from her because I didn't know how to manage, how to regulate what was coming up for me. And so the more I've been practicing with this and noticing my response and my reaction, I'm able to sort of get curious about like, what is that that's coming up in me, which then allows me, when it happens now, I notice it, I'm able to do a little bit of breathing and move through it. And then it's like, it doesn't upset me anymore that she was that way. And what I notice is now she's much quicker to come back and say, hey, mom, I'm really sorry. I lost my cool, or, I'm sorry I said that or whatever. Whereas that never happened before. But because I'm not reacting out of that place of being triggered myself, she's able to see it for what it is and come back, and we're able to come back and repair our relationship much more quickly than we were when I didn't have that awareness of how I was being triggered by what she was saying or doing. So it's less about what others are doing and saying, and it's more about what is being activated in us. And so, one of the things I mentioned is like trying to get curious. So it can be really easy to move into this place of self-judgment, like I shouldn't feel this way, or this is wrong, or whatever it is. And instead moving into this place of curiosity. I wonder what is unresolved that's being pushed on right now. I wonder what's underneath this. And then having that self-compassion, remembering that every single one of us have triggers. Every single one of us have things that are unresolved within us, either because of our own lived experiences, or as we talked about last time, could be ancestral things. It could be things that came from parents, grandparents, great-grandparents, that we still are trying to resolve in our lifetime today. So having that compassion is really important. So that's emotions. And then thinking about thoughts. So thinking about how, what thoughts are really just a representation of something. It's how we construct concepts in our mind. It's how we categorize things and make sense of things. And the brain really loves to do this, again, so that it can predict better. So if we can categorize and organize things, it makes it easier to be able to predict what's going to happen in the future. And sort of this notion, again, that our brain doesn't know the difference between real and imagined, that it processes that information in the same way. And so maybe I'll just mention it now. We're going to do an imagery practice in just a little bit, but when they have done studies on people who are doing imagery, let's say, well, just for a moment, just close your eyes, and I would invite you to imagine just a beautiful sunset, like all of the best colors of the sunset, maybe over the ocean or over a mountain, whatever your preference is. So just really imagining the sunset, the colors, the way that the clouds are, what's underneath. Is it water? Is it land? Is it mountains? Just taking a moment and really noticing all that there is in this sunset that makes it beautiful to you. And what they found is, as they were scanning people's brains, inviting people to just imagine different things like a sunset or a red cardinal or whatever, their visual cortex in their brain started to light up as if they were seeing that thing. So our brain doesn't know the difference between real and imagined when we're really using our senses inside our imagination to make something real. And then the other interesting thing about thought in our brain is, our brain is a bit of an energy hog. Even though it's only this small, what is it, like about 3 pounds or something like that, it uses, when at resting state, it uses 20% of the energy that we take in every day. So our brain consumes a lot of energy. And there's this connection between our thoughts and our emotions. And so I would invite you to maybe just practice becoming aware of when you have a thought about something. Just check in for a moment and notice, is there a sensation in the body? Is there emotion connected to that? Because often we have these thoughts that keep us in these thought emotion loops. So I have a thought about, maybe like something that, maybe I have a fear about something in the future. And then that fear about something in the future creates this like constriction and this anxiety in my, I'm thinking about this terrible future. And then in my body, I start to notice anxiety. I start to notice constriction in my chest. And this anxiety and constriction in my chest then brings up a new thought. Maybe it might even be a different thought, but might be, oh my gosh, am I having a heart attack? Right. So like we sort of go into these thought emotion spirals that can either spiral us downward. And that would be that, another term for that would be rumination, when we're sort of just like going through the same sort of thought patterns and loops. Or they can be more regenerative. And so again, that's where that building that awareness is really critical. Are we in a regenerative thought emotion loop, or are we in a thought emotion loop that is keeping us in rumination and sort of keeping us stuck in old patterns and thinking? And so this is where practices like mindfulness and awareness are really, really helpful. So mindfulness is the state of mind involving introspection and thought process change, compared to awareness, which is a state of mind that's more sensory based. So we're using, the senses we have in our body, what we see, hear, taste, touch, smell, proprioception, interoception, all of these different ways that we take in information. And we're able to use the body through awareness to get back into the present moment. And this is important too, because again, with the prediction brain, one of the things that's happening is it's pulling us into the past, a past experience, and then it projects that into a future. So we actually often, when we're in that state, we're not in the present moment actually experiencing something. We are in the past projecting into the future. And one of the ways, I might have mentioned this before, but one of the ways we can start to notice, are we in the past, present, or future? If we're feeling really depressed, if we're feeling like nothing's going to get better, sort of in that, depressed rumination state, good chance our mind is in the past. If we're feeling a lot of anxiety and overwhelm, chances are we're in some unknown future. And so if we're feeling anxiety or depression, it can be an invitation for us to use our bodies to get back into this moment. Feeling your feet on the ground. If you're sitting, feeling yourself sitting. If you're walking, noticing how your body is moving through space, taking some deep breaths in. What sort of things do you smell? Looking around you, what do you see? So using your body to get present in this moment, because this is the moment, the present moment. When I run my groups, I tell people this is where our power is, because we can't go back and change the past. We can't jump into the future and change it. Our moment to make change is now, in this moment. So the things that we do in this moment, like Barrett talked about, matter for the future. And so then this practicing presencing, practicing being mindful, practicing being aware, helps to sort of offset that prediction brain. It helps us to be more in the moment, actually experiencing it. And sort of a fun thing to do with this would be mindful eating. So there might be something that you really love to eat, or something that you really hate to eat, or something you feel neutral about. But I guarantee you it's a very different experience when you just sort of eat it without thinking on automatic pilot, which is what we tend to do. Or if you eat it mindfully, really using your senses, looking at it as if you've never seen this before, smelling it, looking at the colors, when you put it into your mouth, really slowing down and tasting it. It's a very different experience when we're eating mindfully versus when we're just sort of eating. And so this presencing and awareness really does change the way that we experience the world. And so I talked about how awareness is really key to healing in this. And so a lot of these unconscious thoughts and patterns, the more we practice awareness and presencing, the more we become aware of those unconscious thoughts and patterns. And once we are aware of them, then we have the ability to choose how we want to respond, to change those patterns and those pathways. And remembering that initially it can be really challenging. It takes a lot of energy, sort of like walking for the first time, or learning how to use a smartphone for the first time, or, playing a new sport or a new instrument for the first time. It can be really difficult. The more you do it, the better you're going to get at it. So I want to just take a little bit of time and do just a general awareness meditation. And a little bit of what we did with the 3-sync process is some of that. But just in this general awareness meditation, we'll only do it for a minute or two, but we're just going to sit and we're going to notice sensations that are coming up in the body, noticing emotions that arise, noticing thoughts that come up. And remembering that we are not our sensations or our emotions or our thoughts. And so really trying to have just this awareness of it, observing it as if it's a cloud in the sky that is passing through, or maybe a leaf on a flowing river or stream that we notice it and then it goes and we just let it go. We don't chase after it. We don't try to hop on it. We just simply notice. So let's just do that for a few moments, just noticing sensations in the body, emotions that might be coming up for you, or thoughts that are arising. And the invitation again is just to notice it and then allow it to pass, allow it to go, allow the next thing to come into your awareness, the next thought, sensation, or emotion. We're not trying to push anything away, but we're also not trying to pull it in close. We're just noticing. All right. And so I think when I think about this meditation, I think it's really important because one of the things that I think one of the misconceptions about meditation is that meditation is about clearing your mind. And that is really hard to do. Most people cannot do that. Even some of the best meditators cannot do that. So the point is not to clear your mind. The point is to become aware of what is happening in the mind, to become aware of what is happening in the body, to become aware of what is happening in your emotional body, in your emotional life. And so general awareness meditation is something that you could practice any time of the day. You know, you can practice it when you're driving, you can practice it when you're eating, you can practice it when you're doing housework, you can practice it when you're reading to your kiddos at night. I mean, there's literally nothing that you can't do and practice general awareness. And so I want to talk a little bit about Dr. Bruce Perry again and his neural sequential model. And he talks about the importance again of regulating those bottom parts in order to be able to get to the top parts. And so in those bottom parts, the brainstem, the diencephalon, as you have somatic input coming in from inside our body, sensory input coming in from outside. This all goes through the brainstem, through the lower parts of the brain. And if any of that information is identified as a threat, remember, then we're likely to flip our lid and the top parts of our brain are not going to be online. And so if we notice that we flipped our lid, that's where practices that have to do with rhythm and pattern can be so powerful to regulate those lower parts of the brainstem and the diencephalon, and then be able to allow us to relate to someone else or to the situation that's happening. That gets us into our prefrontal cortex to be able to reason, reflect, to think about what's happening, which then, all of that connects back together. So I want to do a little practice, and if you're sitting and you're able to stand, I would invite you to stand. And so this is just let me move this up a little bit. This is just a little practice where I want you to just follow along with me. Okay, so just do what I'm doing. That's all you got to do. Just do what I'm doing. Okay. And as you're trying to follow along, really notice what's coming up for you, what thoughts, emotions, sensations. Okay, try to keep up. Okay, so just pause for a moment and just notice again, like, how do you feel? Thoughts, emotions. Okay, so now I'm going to invite you to do this again. You can go ahead and follow along with me. Okay. So again, just noticing how you feel, thoughts, emotions that might have come up. And I would invite anything in the chat, just like what you noticed during the two different pieces, or feel free to unmute yourself as well.
We did have a comment earlier.
Yeah.
Came in while you were speaking, and it says, it is very interesting to me to know that people may have the same circumstances in their lives, but due to their own past experiences, the individuals will react differently to it.
Yeah. Yeah.
We got, the second was easier as there was more of a pattern. Perplexed towards the end when I could not follow or hear.
Yeah, so I learned this, I went through a class called Natural Lifemanship, and a lot of it is built on the work of Dr. Bruce Perry. And I noticed when I first did the activity, the first time I noticed myself feeling really anxious, I noticed at one point I just quit. I was like, oh, well, I can't, I can't figure this out. So I just quit. And that's my primary coping mechanism, is dissociating, just checking out, being done with it, right? If I can't, whatever. And so compared to when we did the second time, I noticed my nervous system settling. I noticed a sense of connection as all of us were doing the thing together at the same time. And so this just really highlights how simple something like pattern and rhythm can be to help organize the brain and help regulate the nervous system. And so I know I showed this last time, but these again are some of the tools and practices that Dr. Bruce Perry says can be so helpful for regulating those bottom parts of the brainstem, the diencephalon. So things like drumming, musical instruments, singing, chanting, dancing, swaying, listening to live music, running, walking, all of these things have rhythm and pattern. And not all things are created the same, right? Walking is going to induce something different than running. Heavy metal music is going to be different than like, classical music or something, right? Like all of these things, the way that the rhythm and pattern is going to influence and impact our nervous system. And another thing that's interesting that Dr. Perry said is, if you remember, I think I shared this last time, that one of the reasons this all is so powerful is because we constantly hear our mom's heart beating and the heart and the blood going through her body, that rhythm and pattern. We're in utero, we're not hungry, tired, cold. So an association gets made between having all of our needs met and this rhythm and pattern. But no two moms have the same heart rate, so depending on whether your mom was athletic or not, or whether she had high ACEs or not, or whether she was in a really stressful situation a lot or not, all of that will impact her heart rate, which then impacts how that the developing baby, like what patterns are most relaxing or regulating for them. So there is no one, if you do this pattern, this works for everybody, which I also found was really interesting and speaks back to that piece about how experience shapes the way that we are perceiving what's happening. And so these are just some additional practices that Dr. Perry talks about: meditative breathing, yoga, Tai Chi and Qigong, swinging, massage, equine grooming and riding, and neurobiofeedback and biofeedback. So these are all ways that we can move the body, that we can do breath practices, that we can pay attention to our biology, our heart racing, our hands cold and clammy, our mouth getting dry, or a sense of calm and relaxation in the body, right? So all of these are biofeedback, easy ways that we can tap into what's happening in our biology to get a sense of where are we at in our nervous system. And I know I mentioned this last time too, and I've mentioned it several times today, but I think it's so important to remember that the brain doesn't know the difference between physical and emotional pain, and it also doesn't know the difference between real and imagined. And so one of the practices in the mind body medicine groups that I run is imagery, and a way to connect with sort of the unconscious wisdom that we have is things like pictures and images, symbols, metaphors, emotions. These are all ways that we can connect into that unconscious. And again, when we are doing imagery, and we'll go ahead and do just a really quick imagery practice. When we do imagery, we are, the more we can use our senses in our imagination, the more real it will become, the greater the impact it will have on our physical and mental well-being. So I would invite you to just get your body into a comfortable position, maybe slowing your breath down a little bit, having your inhale be a little bit deeper and your exhale a little bit longer. And remembering that our breath is the most powerful tool we have to regulate our nervous system. And so now I would invite you to think of a place, a very special place, a place where you feel completely comfortable and at ease. And this place could be a place indoors or outside. It could be a place out of a book or a movie, or it could be straight out of your imagination. It doesn't really matter. What matters most is that you feel completely comfortable and at ease in this place. And if you find yourself sort of hopping from place to place, you can enjoy that for a moment or two, but eventually choose just one place to stay. And as this place comes to your mind, I invite you to use all of your senses, noticing what sounds do you hear? What smells are there? Maybe noticing the air on your skin and your feet securely on the ground. Just taking some time to touch and feel the whole environment that you're in. And maybe noticing what you're wearing. Notice if you have anything on your feet. And how old are you? Becoming aware of if you are alone or with another person or a group of people, or maybe with a pet or an animal. Becoming aware of what the light is like and noticing what time of day and what time of year it is. Maybe noticing the temperature. Is it warm, hot, or cool? And maybe as you're looking around, maybe you notice something that you need to bring in to make the place just right, or something that you need to remove, and you can go ahead and do that now. And then notice how you feel in this place then. So just taking a few more moments to really soak in being in your special place and noticing all of the things that make it special and comfortable for you. And remembering that you can return to this place or some other place anytime that you need to recharge, to get away for just take a little mental break, to regenerate regenerative emotions, to bring in emotions like calm, safety, sense of connection. And so just closing this meditation with a nice inhale in through the nose Exhaling out through the mouth. And I just wanted to share this last resource really quickly. When I was the director of the Tribal Neurosciences and Community Wisdom Project, we created a podcast called Remembering Resilience. You can find it on Apple Music, on Spotify, I think just about anywhere you find your, you would find your podcasts. And so we just are finished putting all of season 2 on there. And it talks about a lot of the concepts, not necessarily that we talked about today, a little bit of that, but a lot of the stuff that we talked about last time and some of the stuff that we'll talk about next time as well. But I just wanted to share that resource. And I know we're just about at time again, so I'm gonna